Why?
Well, I think it's generous to call them plans. Certainly, if one looks at what was released on Sunday evening by the health minister, no concrete timelines, no concrete orders, no indication of even which vaccine that South Africa is looking at. So I think that while other countries last year already were placing orders for vaccines that were in research, countries like Colombia have now been able to secure it. And many of these countries in Latin America, India, North America, the European Union have begun a significant rollout of vaccines in their countries to their citizens. And I think that the fact that we're now sitting in 2021 with no clear indication when the vaccine will be here points to gross negligence on behalf of government.
And one of the things that you've said is that government does not have its priorities straight. In what way and how do they, in your opinion, get their priorities to once again be realigned?
Well, I think that governments ask citizens to sacrifice a great deal, both in their businesses, in their income, etc. But government itself has not made any sacrifices. One of the suggestions we're making about getting priorities right is to cancel the South African Airways bailout, stop diverting money to Denel, Alex Core, and all these other non-essential state-led entities, and reappropriate that money into the frontline war against COVID-19. If COVID-19 is the biggest priority, then surely the budget must follow that. The safety and security and health of our citizens has got to be more important than the 10.5 billion we're pumping into an airline that is unable to fly.
And what are your overall thoughts on how government is working with Business Unity South Africa as well as the Solidarity Fund to ensure that vaccines are indeed procured?
Well, I think that there's obviously a multi-sectoral approach that's required, but I think it's an indictment on government that we have to rely on the Solidarity Fund to come up with money for this. We have money. We spent 1.7 billion rand a year on VIP protection services for ministers. We are spending 10.5 billion on the SAA bailout. And I just really think that we've got to get a government that gets its priorities right. We are going to be dealing with this virus for another 18 months potentially. We can't have lockdowns as our only solution or only answer to the problem. We have to get the vaccine here as quickly as possible. We've got to make sure that vulnerable people and frontline healthcare workers receive it. And we've tabled a comprehensive 6-point plan, which would assist government to expedite this process and to move it up and to ensure that we get the vaccine here far, far sooner than government's projections of sometime in the second quarter of this year.
And if you could just summarize that 6-point plan, some of the key points that you are advocating for or suggesting.
Well, what we're advocating for is expedited bilaterals with all approved vaccine suppliers in the world and making sure that we're able to secure it. We can't rely on the COVAX program alone. Colombia realized that. They were also signatories to the COVAX program, but realized it was going to come too late. And so it did a bilateral procurement in December for their citizens with Johnson & Johnson. We then need to determine which vaccine we're going to get and how many doses we're going to be able to provide for it. And then we have to have a rollout plan. No use having the vaccine come here without a comprehensive rollout plan. That you're going to have to, if government wants to reach its own target, doing 167,000 vaccinations per day, 4.4 million a month if you want to reach the 67% target by the end of the year. So there needs to be a comprehensive rollout, and there's going to have to be a procurement of syringes, swabs, needles, disinfectants, and fridges to store it as well.
You mentioned earlier on that it's a bit ambitious to have labeled what was put forth by the government as a plan. You have rolled out, as you say, a 6-point plan. Is this something that you've been in communication with the relevant ministries to advocate for an expedition of this nature?
Yes, much like all of our programs, whether it was our ministerial blue book, our smart lockdown model, our COVID-19 action plan for the incapable state, all of these have been proactive plans that have been shared with the relevant government departments. It's part of our commitment. There, some people say, oh, well, the DA is always criticizing. I think it's an unfair criticism when we have a very strong track record of placing on the table workable alternatives. This 6-point plan is a workable alternative, and we believe it can make a significant difference in bringing more accountability and transparency, as well as expediting the acquisition of this vaccine so that we can save lives and livelihoods in South Africa and without having to have only lockdown as an option.
Mr. Steenhuisen, what we've seen is the issue of storage of these vaccines being a major impediment around the world, a lot of them requiring extreme low degrees of temperature. What are the suggestions that you're putting forward as to how the storage issue can be circumvented?
Well, that was part of the 6-point plan, that we plan on acquiring the refrigeration units that are necessary. Luckily, one of the latest vaccines that's been approved and it's been rolled out in the UK and other places around the world is the AstraZeneca vaccine. It only requires a 6-degree cooling, so that's well within the bounds probably of what we already have in many of our hospitals. But we need to decide which vaccine we're going to go with and start preparing for it. If we're going to use one of the others, there's going to have to be cold storage facilities. We're going to have to identify hospitals, clinics, where it's going to be stored. And we have to have a plan around how it's going to be rolled out in communities across South Africa. That's what we don't have at the moment. We don't see any plan from government around how they intend to make these acquisitions and how they intend to roll out the vaccine when it gets here. And I think the government's dropped the ball spectacularly here, but it's not too late to pick it up. We can expedite these processes. And our 6-point plan, I think, is a really workable way to be able to achieve these things.
There's been a measure of debate as far as the usage of the vaccine when it does become available. Is it going to be a voluntary process? Will people eventually need to take the vaccine in order to go back to work? What is the DA's stance on the vaccine and whether or not people can choose to take it?
Well, I think it sets out very clearly in the Constitution that every South African has the right to bodily integrity. I don't think that anyone could be forced to take the vaccine against their will, but I would certainly hope that vulnerable people, people with comorbidities, people in the risky age group, as well as our frontline healthcare workers and healthcare and frontline responders would be first in the queue to be able to receive these vaccines. But I think it would be entirely problematic to force citizens to take a vaccine. It must be voluntary. If there's people who don't want to take it, then they're going to have to accept that managing the virus for them is going to be self-isolation and the like. But if we're going to get back to some form of normal, and I use the term normal loosely because I wonder how long we'll ever be able to get back to normal, the vaccine is our best shot at it. And that is why we've got to marshal every resource available in the country to be able to get access to the vaccine and get our economy a fighting chance at some form of recovery.
Correctional services have been identified as areas where there's a high probability for the spread of COVID-19, and government has identified inmates as one of the first priority groups to receive the vaccine. Your response to this as the DA?
I think that the people who should be prioritized for this is any South African that is at risk of the COVID-19 virus, people that are in the high risk category. We know that the prevalence amongst younger people is far less, that the people with comorbidities are very, very vulnerable to it. So anybody in South Africa who falls within those categories should be prioritized. But I really do think that if we are going to get a limited amount up front, I think that our healthcare workers particularly should be at the front of the queue for that long before people in correctional facilities are there. And then we can obviously move on into people who are vulnerable and whoever they may be and wherever they may be.
As the new year begins, people are starting to make their way back to their places of work. Many had gone home, crossed the provincial borders and are going back to their places of work. You know, in some instances, perhaps having contracted the virus or having exposed others to the virus. What do you believe need to be the contingency measures as we enter yet another phase of COVID-19 within the second resurgence?
Yeah, well, I think we've got to focus on the basics as well: mask wearing, sanitizing, all of those things. Public transport, particularly, I think are hotspots, and we need to make sure that the proper practice of social distancing, mask wearing, and sanitization is taking place. And people must be responsible. Obviously, we're going to have to limit big events for some time to come until there is some form of immunity that has developed. But we need to be responsible. I think that nobody is saying that citizens don't have a role to play. I think what I and others are saying is that, yes, there is a responsibility by citizens, but there's also a responsibility of government to be doing everything it can in the fight against this devastating virus. We must understand that in wintertime, there is a very likelihood that, like we've seen in Europe and other parts of the country that are going through their cold period now, that there is a resurgence. We're in a hot period now, so there is a likelihood that there may be other waves that come. There may not, but the vaccine is the only path for us to be able to return to some form of normality.
Now, the issue of the vaccination plan has been quite paramount for you. You've written to the Speaker of the National Assembly, Thandi Modise, and you've requested an urgent debate on this matter. Have you received any response from her, and what do you hope to achieve by this debate?
Well, Parliament is the arena of executive accountability, and I think one of the things that has characterized the COVID-19 response by government is the shroud of secrecy that we've seen, locking down on information, not sharing information, etc. I think that Parliament has a duty and responsibility to be holding the Health Minister and the Executive accountable. The President gives an announcement. There's no opportunity for journalists to ask questions, tough questions around what he said. So the Speaker's refused the debate. We've written back to try and get her to change her mind. But at the same time, we're calling for an ad hoc committee of Parliament to be created now, given that government has dropped the ball so spectacularly, that a multi-party committee of Parliament is set up to exercise oversight of the vaccine acquisition as well as the rollout strategy for the country. I think that will bring a greater measure of accountability.
Before I let you go, Mr. Steenhuisen, you have repeated several times how you believe the government has dropped the ball. I'm going to ask you, what has government done right regarding COVID-19?
I think the initial lockdown was the right thing to do, that first 3 to 5 weeks of lockdown, because it was meant to help us build up our health capacity to deal with inevitable spikes that would happen once a lockdown ended. I think that the closure of big public events on high days and holidays was the right call to make. You don't want super spreader events taking place. And I think the campaigning around mask wearing, sanitation, etc., is the right way to go. What you want to do is make citizens partners in the combating of COVID-19. And so I just wish that they had listened a little bit more and been a bit more collaborative in their approach with other political parties from the beginning of the crisis, because I think that no party, including my own, has a monopoly on plans and good ideas. And we should be marshalling the resources of every South African across the board in the fight against this. And this is what frustrates me so much, that while we were so busy with bans and ridiculous things around chickens, etc., other countries were preparing for a vaccine rollout, and they're going to recover, and their economies are going to recover far sooner than ours. And I think that's a huge problem.
And we'll leave it at that for this afternoon. Mr. Steenhuisen, thank you very much for your time.